You are looking live at Kyiv, Ukraine right now. Talks are underway this morning between Ukrainian and Russian officials to evacuate civilians from cities under siege. Russian forces killed more than 30 people in a cruise missile strike on a military base 15 miles from the Polish border. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that he wants direct talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Zelensky is warning NATO leaders they're drawing closer to a fight they can't avoid.
I'll reiterate now that if you don't close our skies, then it's just a matter of time before Russian missiles will hit your territory, NATO's territory, houses of NATO citizens.
Russian attacks nearing NATO territory could mean it's only a matter of time before Western nations are pulled into combat.
Washington leaders say the U.S. is committed to helping Ukraine, but they will not engage in fighting in that country, and that means they will not impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Here to help us navigate the current state of the conflict and all that's happened the last 19 days since the invasion started is UNC Chapel Hill professor Milada Vachdova. Milada, first, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I want to start here. 19 days in, the most recent, we've seen attacks now in the western part of the Ukraine. Previously, it had been other places. The West was thought to be safe. How concerning is that now we're seeing attacks in the West?
Well, I think it really reflects the frustration of Putin and of the Russian government. They have faced enormous setbacks. They haven't been able to take territory, to take any of the key cities. And as a result, they're doing two things. On the one hand, they're just shelling cities. So they have them encircled and they're just pounding them. They're reducing them to rubble. And of course, there's a lot of casualties. And then also they're sending, missiles into the west of the country to try to hit military targets. But again, the targeting is very indiscriminate, and it's clearly a show of both, the incredible force that Russia has, but also frustration with its pretty substantial losses.
I'm curious, Milada, you talk about the frustration that Putin is going through right now. What do you think it will take to satisfy him? Is it an official takeover? I mean, we know talks are going on, but I just don't feel like talks are going to do anything for Putin. He's not a talking kind of guy.
I think what we have is the clash of two completely different political systems. Ukraine is a democratic country, a pluralist country, a country where elected officials serve the public imperfectly, like in any democracy, but it really is a democratic regime. And this is what Putin despises. He wants Ukraine to become part of Russia, to be under his control. The Ukrainians will not surrender on those terms, right? They will not. In fact, Putin has recently, said things like that the Ukrainian nation doesn't exist, really seeming to want to just kind of annex the whole country and destroy the Ukrainian nation. And so, no, talks will not make progress there. However, this war is incredibly costly for Russia. And so at some point, as the Ukrainians continue to inflict losses on the Russians, I think there might be scope for some kind of a climb down. But for the West, for NATO, for the US government, the question is when, and how much are we going to just sit back and watch Ukraine get destroyed?
What would be that breaking point for NATO to say, okay, we need to escalate? We've said we won't send our boys and girls in there to fight, but what's the breaking point? We saw an American journalist who was killed over the weekend. Is there a breaking point you say, if this happens, then NATO will step it up?
Well, I do think it's a mistake in terms of U.S. government strategy to have President Biden saying, we will not fight in Ukraine. So he says we will protect every inch of NATO territory, but essentially he is saying you can do whatever you want in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, and we will not we will not go in. I think that's dangerous. Well, it's heartbreaking for Ukraine, and it doesn't sort of honor the incredible thing up for democracy, for free society. But it's also dangerous because we have the possibility of a nuclear accident. We have the possibility of chemical weapons being used. And we have the possibility of the conflict expanding into NATO countries. So I think in terms of strategy, this is just empowering Putin at this particular moment.
Well, and now we have talks, Milada, of China. Let's throw China into the mix here. We know today White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is meeting with some Chinese representatives and advisors in Rome. More talks, but there's this interesting relationship with China. How do you think that's going to play into all of this?
Yeah, China is becoming a key to this story. So on the one hand, China has a lot to gain because Russia is now going to be incredibly dependent on China in terms of its financial system, trade, buying Chinese cars instead of Western cars, and so forth. On the other hand, this is dangerous for China because China's power depends on being an essential and integral part of the world economy. And so anything that disrupts the world economy can make China much poorer. We see Russia actually now asking, allegedly, the Chinese are denying it, asking for weapons and supplies for the war from China. And so I think it's critical that we that American diplomacy tries to dissuade China from doing this. But it's another telling sign that the Russian war machine is just not what everyone thought it was. The kinds of problems they're having on the ground in terms of equipment and logistics. I know a lot of your viewers know a lot about what a military can and can't do and should be able to do. We've seen such basic problems with supplies, with tires that don't work. A lot of these tanks and not tanks, but vehicles have been abandoned because they have cheap tires that just are popping. So they are asking China to help plug some of these holes in their supply chains and logistics. I hope China doesn't do it.
Milada, I want to ask you, you've written extensively about how some countries struggle to deal with democratic versus authoritarian leaders. And we know in Russia that they don't get a lot of news, but some people have VPNs. These private networks are able to get the news of what's going on. At what point do you think that the Russian people, in terms of public perception, do we see a change against Vladimir Putin? They're struggling to take over the Ukraine. There's more news coming in. There's some people feeling conflicted about killing Ukrainian citizens. In public perception, do you see it changing against Vladimir Putin at all?
It is very difficult to know, sort of have a general sense of public opinion in Russia. We see both indications of resistance and protest and incredibly brave Russians coming out to protest and being immediately arrested. We know that demand through VPN of those blocked news channels has skyrocketed. On the other hand, we also have a lot of evidence of support by Russians for the war. I think the problem is that this is a society it's an authoritarian regime. People are afraid. People are afraid to speak out. And actually, they're even afraid to seek out accurate information. Until 3 weeks ago, the internet was completely open in Russia. And yet, large majority of the population didn't seek out accurate news, was only watching the Kremlin television. So you have to actually not only you have to seek out that accurate information, and it feels like a large portion of the Russian population is not getting it.
It is coming up on 8/11. Milada Vachdova, UNC Chapel Hill political science professor, and you are our Eastern European scholar and expert, and we thank you for helping us understand the relationships, what's going on the other side of the world, and we hope this war does not continue and fewer lives are lost. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.